Hey friends, welcome back to a brand new video here on the Bioshock Hub. Thank you so much for stopping by, I really do appreciate it. The last time I uploaded a compilation video like this was a couple of weeks ago about cut content in Bioshock, and you guys seemed to really enjoy that video. So today I wanted to upload another compilation for you guys, and this one is going to focus on Bioshock lore videos that I've done in the past, and I enjoy doing lore videos, so it's a win-win. Anyways, if you guys want to see more compilation videos or any more lore videos in the future, please let me know down in the comments section below. And if you enjoy the video by the end, be sure to hit that subscribe button. I would very much appreciate it. And let's hit 40,000 subscribers. So with that being said, sit back, relax, and enjoy the over 1 hour of Bioshock lore. Thank you guys. When there was no more Andrew Ryan, when there was no more Frank Fontaine, someone was still plotting a takeover of Rapture. With these two out of her way, it was her time to take Rapture over and mold it in her own image. She was going to create her version of a perfect utopia by using her background in psychiatry on the citizens left in Rapture. I'm of course talking about Dr. Sofia Lamb, leader of Rapture, founder of the Rapture family, and the antagonist of Bioshock 2. In today's video, we'll be talking about her backstory, which includes her hatred for Delta, her disregard for a motherly instinct towards Eleanor, life pre-Rapture, and much more. If you don't want Bioshock 2 to be spoiled for you at all, I would highly recommend going and finishing that game and coming back to this video at a later date. So, otherwise, if you don't mind, would you kindly sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. Early in life, while in the care of her father, who was also a physician, she adapted his philosophy and ideology of a greater good, which he referred to as the triage imperative. She grew fond of this idea and decided to follow within his footsteps. She attended the University of Oxford and decided to study medicine, along with psychiatry. After her studies, she was living in Hiroshima during the Second World War and was working as a missionary at that time. She also provided medical attention to the survivors of the bombings. Although she herself survived the dropping of the bomb, she was informed that her close friends were killed in the Hiroshima bombings, or Hiroshima bombings. After this discovery, she was outraged to discover the fact that the United States was using the idea of a greater good, an idea that she was enamored with, if you remember, to justify their bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This event shaped her line of thinking that the world was essentially destined to destroy itself. Andrew Ryan discovered how good she was in the field of psychiatry and decided to extend an invitation to Rapture for her. He wanted her expertise to help provide counseling for Rapture's isolated citizens. Of course, she gladly accepted this invitation and was set to make her way to Rapture. After accepting Andrew Ryan's invitation to Rapture, Sofia soon started to spread her thoughts and ideals in hopes of enlightening citizens towards a quote, common good, to be able to create a true utopia, which Ryan wasn't too keen on. At first, it didn't seem like anything was out of the norm. And as a matter of fact, Lamb did many things that I truly commend her for and actually respect. I'll mention more on that in a little bit. Sofia Lamb offered free therapy sessions to those who lived within Pauper's Drop. If you guys don't know that location or don't remember, that is essentially the poorest location in all of Rapture. She intentionally threw poker games to share wealth with citizens who needed money, and she essentially created an art gallery on her own personal property of Rapture, that being in Dionysus Park. So the reason why I do commend her, even though it could have been a ruse to try to throw Andrew Ryan off, I commend her for having actual good respect for the citizens that she was taking care of. And she did have well intentions at first, but then I think over time, with being exposed to everything that was in Rapture at that time, it slowly morphed her into the person that she became during Bioshock 2. So, yes, her thoughts and good intentions might have been there first, and initially, it could have changed over time just to throw Andrew Ryan off her trail. Let me know what you guys think of that down in the comment section below. After Eleanor was born, Sofia had the idea that Eleanor would be the perfect child to be the new leader of her own utopia. However, Sofia, with pushing her ideas, and wishes on Eleanor, she was especially cruel in doing so. She didn't allow Eleanor to come into contact with any other children in Rapture, though Eleanor snuck out a few times, as demonstrated by this audio diary here.
In ethical psychiatry, we must account for...
Eleanor Lamb speaking. Mum says I'm not to play with the other children because they're being raised on a diet of dog-eat-dog. I wanted to see these dog-eaters, so I waited until Mum was gone and went out to find one. And guess what? The dog-eaters wear human skins. It makes them look just like us.
Like most of us right now, Sofia Lamb essentially self-isolated Eleanor and taught her privately, which she hoped would result in Eleanor gaining a genius-level IQ. Now that some time had passed, Sofia Lamb's influence had grown with Rapture's citizens. Thus, Andrew Ryan started to get annoyed with her and the fact of her sending an invite to Rapture in the first place. It was the ideas of Lamb's altruism versus Ryan's capitalist society, which was free of religious or government interference. So, these clashings led to a series of public debates, which he had hoped that would lessen her influence over his citizens by showcasing all of the flaws within her reasoning. Later on, Sofia Lamb's followers essentially started their own religion around her ideals, and a book, hence where the Rapture family comes from. Here, instead of a Bible or another form of religious text, as I mentioned, they used her book called Unity and Metamorphosis as their Bible. Pretty odd choice, but nonetheless, I respect it. To Andrew Ryan, Lamb was an ongoing threat to Rapture. It got to the point where he broke some of his own ethical and moral codes to arrest her. He did so by giving Stanley Poole the task of spying on her and trying to gather as much dirt on Sofia as he possibly could. Eventually, enough information was gathered, and Sofia was then imprisoned in Persephone, along with a multitude of her Rapture family members. Before being incarcerated, she entrusted Grace Holloway to watch and raise Eleanor until her sentence was done. Little did she know, Eleanor wouldn't be with Grace for that much longer. While incarcerated at Persephone, Augustus Sinclair put Lamb to work as a therapist for other inmates that were also incarcerated, hoping to make them a bit more docile or more controllable. Lamb used her freedom to gain support through other prisoners, and even from some of the prison staff themselves, such as Nigel Ware. However, Sinclair soon began selling volunteer inmates to Fontaine Futuristics for test subjects and Big Daddy candidates. This situation brutally tested Lamb's ideals as she maintained her position by selecting people from her own supporters for Adam experiments. Lamb did not immediately return to Rapture after her freedom. On New Year's Eve of 1958, she journeyed to Adonis Luxury Resort and orchestrated the abduction of her daughter, Eleanor Lamb, from Subject Delta, which you see at the beginning of Bioshock 2. From 1959 to 1960, Lamb remained in Persephone, tinkering with plasmids, gene tonics, etc., on her own willing test subjects. You have to be a very powerful person to have people that are willingly opening up their bodies for you to test whatever you want on them. It's a lot of dedication. Her supporters saw Persephone as a bastion of hope from which they could eventually emerge to rebuild the city after the fighting of the Rapture Civil War was done. There's a lot of delusions here. That's one thing that I want to really reiterate to you guys. The Rapture family, and even Sofia Lamb herself, were very delusional in their thoughts and some of their flawed ideals and ideas. Sofia also made numerous visits to the near-abandoned Fontaine Futuristics, where she met Dr. Gilbert Alexander and converted him to her altruistic beliefs. With Gil's help, she also succeeded in removing the little sister mental conditioning from Eleanor. After the deaths of both Frank Fontaine and Andrew Ryan in 1960, Sofia could truly move throughout Rapture without any fear whatsoever. Eventually, she learned about Fontaine's programming of Jack, that being under the "would you kindly" phrase. She believed that this was the perfect example of her altruistic views, acting to uphold the common good without any free will whatsoever. Unfortunately, her scientific side got the best of her. She didn't really care about breaking the conditioning, and she didn't really care about the actual mind control itself. Yes, the mind control helped in terms of changing Rapture and molding it into what she wanted. She cared more about the effects of the actual conditioning process herself. That's why I said her scientific side took over. She cares about the experiment and the result, not how she gets that result, if that makes sense. Thus, Sofia Lamb began her own attempt to create an intellect that would be completely selfless and unerringly good. The plan itself involved giving the subject massive amounts of Adam. If you guys watched my Gilbert Alexander video, you would know the fate of this experiment and the fate of Gilbert Alexander. Unfortunately, at the time, Gilbert Alexander volunteered as the first subject. Unfortunately, and as I mentioned in that video, the experiment began to go wrong as the atom distorted Gilbert's genetic structure, or changing him into an all different person than when he initially went in that tank. And it's pretty heartbreaking what happens. If you guys want to watch that video, there'll be a card at the top right hand corner of the screen. She had control over most of Rapture's populace after this experiment through the influence of the Rapture family, but the little sisters who could still supply Adam were becoming too old. Thus, in 1967, she orchestrated the idea of the Big Sisters, and they were sent to the surface to abduct young girls to be converted into brand new little sisters to continue maintaining and manufacturing Adam. Imagine being a little sister and having to stand there and watch your protector or your father shoot himself due to your mother's orders. Imagine having your mother try to brainwash you into becoming Rapture's first utopian, and then listen to her propaganda. Then imagine bringing your father back 10 years later and assisting him in helping reunite Eleanor and Subject Delta. This is the reality of Eleanor Lamb, daughter of Sofia. So with that being said, sit back, relax, and enjoy the story of Eleanor Lamb. Hey guys, very quickly before we actually hop into the video, I just wanted to let you know that the Mark Meltzer video is coming. Be patient. This is going to take a long time to make just for the fact that this story in and of itself can be its own game. So I want to make it as perfect as possible. Anyways, with that being said, let's hop into the story of Eleanor Lamb. Eleanor Lamb is the daughter of Sofia Lamb and a previous little sister in Rapture. Roughly 10 years after the 1958 New Year's Eve riots, she contacts Subject Delta, beginning the events of Bioshock 2. Eleanor still remembers Delta after 10 years and knows he is searching for her. Throughout the course of the game, she will mentally communicate with him through their pair bond connection and leave some gifts and messages written on the walls of the city. In the story of Bioshock 2, her behavior and personality is highly influenced by Delta's actions towards the little sisters and NPCs, and we'll go over the endings at the end of the video. Eleanor was raised by her mother, Sofia Lamb, in isolation from the other children of Rapture. Sofia lectured her daughter on philosophy and psychology, hoping to raise her to uphold her altruistic ideals. As a young girl, Eleanor was highly intelligent and taught herself how to take apart and reconstruct electronics. However, she disobeyed her mother on numerous occasions, sneaking out to see other kids and disabling the security systems her mother installed. At first, Eleanor was standoffish towards the other children, whimsically referring to them as dog eaters, since her mother told her they were raised on a dog-eat-dog diet. During one of Eleanor's frequent escapes, she meets a boy named Amir and got into a fight with him, making his nose bleed in the process, but eventually became his friend. In a later audio diary, Eleanor mentions that she had a childhood crush on him. When Eleanor was about 7 years old, her mother, Sofia Lamb, was arrested by Andrew Ryan and taken away to Persephone. Eleanor was entrusted into the care of one of her mother's patients and close follower, Grace Holloway, who had long wanted a child, and Eleanor lived with her for a time in her apartment at the Sinclair Deluxe in Pauper's Drop. This arrangement proved short-lived, because Eleanor quickly discovered that Stanley Poole was Ryan's spy, who had gathered information on her mother's political activities, and he was now bankrupting Dionysus Park through overspending and throwing mad parties. Eleanor eventually confronted Stanley and threatened to tell her mother what he was doing with her home, fortune, and followers. In fear of reprisal, Poole had Eleanor kidnapped and sold to the Little Sisters orphanage. Eleanor spent time in the orphanage in Siren Alley before she was transferred to the care of Dr. Gilbert Alexander. Dr. Alexander, who was ignorant of her true identity, turned her into a little sister and partnered her with Subject Delta. However, Eleanor's time as a little sister did not last very long because Sofia Lamb escaped from prison and tracked her daughter down on New Year's Eve, 1958. With the help of a gang of splicers, Sofia managed to abduct Eleanor and used a mind-control plasmid on Subject Delta to command him to shoot himself. Sofia then retreated back to Persephone, taking Eleanor with her. Since then, Eleanor constantly thought of Delta, and she still dreamt about him. Sofia worked with Dr. Alexander over several years to rehabilitate Eleanor. Eventually, they were able to undo her little sister conditioning, but they could not remove the sea slug that had been implanted within her. Sofia then began her plans to create a perfect altruist by using Adam to experiment on Gilbert Alexander, who volunteered to become the first Utopian. During this time, Eleanor was confined to Persephone and the Fontaine Futuristics building, but she was horrified at seeing the changes Dr. Alexander went through as the experiment began to fail. She became more rebellious, seeing the hypocrisy in her mother's altruistic ideals. For example, Dr. Lamb forcing her will on others, just as Andrew Ryan did before her. Only while she wanted to force her ideals to eliminate the self, he wanted to take control to eliminate the parasites, both becoming what they despised, and Eleanor wanted to escape. However, Sofia Lamb changed the focus of her experiments to Eleanor when she realized that Gil Alexander would not succeed. Lamb realized that Eleanor's condition as a little sister protected her from the genetic damage that would be caused by using Adam. Thus, Dr. Lamb began injecting Eleanor with massive doses of Adam and glorifying her as a holy vessel for her loyal followers in the Rapture family. As a result of her mother's experiments and plans for her, Eleanor started to think of an escape. Eleanor had formed a bond with the new little sisters kidnapped from the surface, and she could control their actions outside of Persephone. Using them, she was able to carry out her plans around the city, even though her mother had trapped her in confinement. Part of Eleanor's rebellion against her mother was remembering her time with her bonded Big Daddy, Subject Delta. Thus, Eleanor sent out little sisters to find samples of Delta's genetic sequence, planning to revive him at a Vita chamber. With the help of Bridget Tenenbaum, she succeeded in removing Delta's Big Daddy conditioning and brought him back to life.
Key from him. Find the code to the watchtower or work out a way to draw him out. Sinclair is moving, Father. Track him.
In her bid for freedom and escape to the surface, Eleanor instigated the events of Bioshock 2 by using the new little sisters to resurrect Subject Delta, more than 10 years after his original death. Due to the powerful and potentially lethal bond they share, Delta is forced to journey through Rapture and seek his former little sister. Eleanor aids him whenever she can by leaving him gifts and messages from the little sisters, and she tries to hide her contact with him from her mother. Eleanor observes the way Delta interacts with the little sisters, choosing to save them or kill them, and the way he gives mercy or vengeance to the people he meets. Delta then begins to learn more about himself and Eleanor as he travels through the city. However, during this time, her mother is not deceived, and she begins to accelerate Eleanor's treatments as Delta draws nearer. Eventually, Delta arrives in Persephone to find Eleanor imprisoned in a quarantine chamber. Eleanor is in a deep sleep as he approaches, but as he tries to enter the chamber, Sofia smothers Eleanor with a pillow, stopping her heart long enough to sever the pair bond and put Delta in a coma. Eleanor recovers and tries to salvage her connection with Delta, sending him a little sister to control and helping him escape from his bondings. Eleanor gets him to bring her a big sister suit for her to wear so they can escape together. Eleanor then joins Delta to fight against the remnants of the Rapture family in Persephone to reach Augustus Sinclair's escape pod to the surface. When she fights, Eleanor uses the big sister powers that she has accumulated from all the atoms she absorbed over the years. The player's choice of whether to harvest or save little sisters affects Eleanor's personality in combat. If Delta saved all the little sisters, then her personality will be one of righteous anger at her mother and the Rapture family. If Delta harvested one or more little sisters, her personality will be one of cruel amusement as she enjoys toying with her enemies in revenge for what she had done to her. The explosion charges rigged by Lamb's followers cause the chamber holding the lifeboat to fill with water. Thinking quickly, Eleanor forms a plan to use the other little sisters to help her boil off the water. Depending on the player's choice to either harvest or save the little sisters throughout the game, Eleanor will either use the little sisters completely, draining them of their energy and killing them in the process, or be gentler to them, eventually bringing them with her into the escape pod and saving them.
I will take all that you hold dear. Sinclair is just another body in your wake.
Depending upon Delta's choices in dealing with the little sisters and the NPCs, that includes Grace Holloway, Stanley Poole, and Gilbert Alexander, good, neutral, and bad endings are possible. As the final bombs in the level detonate, Eleanor races with Subject Delta to reach the elevator to the escape pod. A set of charges goes off directly in their path, forcing Eleanor to teleport to the rising escape craft. Delta is stranded on the outside of the pod, while Eleanor makes it safely inside and finds her mother there. Sofia is drowning due to the flooding inside of the escape craft, and Delta's choices of whether or not to save or kill the adults and little sisters he met earlier in the game affect whether Eleanor takes pity on her mother and gives her oxygen to keep her alive, or whether she pulls her down to drown her. The events after they reach the surface depend purely upon the player's choice to save or harvest the little sisters. As Sofia Lamb struggles to reach a pocket of air, Eleanor will swim in and hand her mother a small air tank to breathe from, allowing her to live. If Delta has saved all of the little sisters and have been merciful towards at least one of the NPCs, then Sofia Lamb will be saved from drowning by her daughter. If Delta has harvested at least one little sister but spared all of the NPCs, Eleanor will also let her mother live. Depending on how the little sisters have been treated, Eleanor says different things during the sequence, which you can read on screen now. If Delta has saved all of the little sisters and killed every NPC, then Eleanor will drown her mother. Sofia also drowns if Delta has harvested at least one little sister and killed at least one NPC. Depending on how the little sisters have been treated, Eleanor says different things during the sequence, again, which you can read on the screen now.
We're almost to the pediatric ward. I expect we'll be fighting our way inside.
This one dies alone and afraid. Stand in our way and you'll get the same.
The good ending. If Delta saved every little sister, then on the surface he will breathe his last breaths in Eleanor's arms. She crosses his arms on his chest, then lovingly and respectfully extracts his atom, allowing him to be a part of her. Eleanor and the rescued little sisters will then gather together under bright, warm weather. One of the little sisters hands Eleanor the doll of Subject Delta she made years ago, which she takes and drops into the sea. Choice endings. If Delta saves at least one little sister and harvests at least one little sister, he gets a choice ending. In this scenario, he can choose to either live or die. The sacrifice ending. On the surface, Eleanor moves to extract Adam from the dying Delta, but he grabs her wrist at the last second, preventing it. Eleanor then drags the dying Delta to the edge of the water, and he spends his last moments staring at his reflection, turning towards her one last time before collapsing, while Eleanor cries and contemplates the loneliness ahead of her, but thanks him for securing her freedom. The weather and the mood is calm, yet dark and gloomy. The survival choice. In the survival ending, Eleanor extracts Delta's essence calmly. She watches as the bodies of dead splicers rise to the surface. The corpse-filled ocean crashes violently as a powerful thunderstorm rages overhead, foreshadowing the bloody future the world might face, as it may now have to confront the might of Rapture's godlike genetic technologies wielded by Eleanor. And finally, the bad ending. If Delta harvested every single little sister, then Eleanor takes Delta's essence against his will. She watches as the bodies of dead splicers rise to the surface. The corpse-filled ocean crashes violently as a powerful thunderstorm rages overhead, foreshadowing the bloody future the world might face, as it may now have to confront the might of Rapture's godlike genetic technologies wielded by the genius and cruelty of Eleanor. My oh my, what Rapture could have been. Just look at the elegance, the absolute beauty, the incredible atmosphere. But all of that was ruined on New Year's Eve in 1958 due to the bombing of the Kashmir restaurant. What followed afterwards shaped Rapture and its downfall due to a civil war between Frank Fontaine and Andrew Ryan. In today's video, we'll be diving into the entirety of Rapture's Civil War, its aftermath, and the turmoil Rapture went through during the Civil War. So, ladies and gentlemen, this video is going to be quite a long one, so if you don't mind, would you kindly sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. From the very beginning of Rapture, there was always some built-up tension due to Andrew Ryan's philosophical beliefs where the strong and wealthy would thrive and the weak and the poor would be left behind. In a society that had the idea to have the rich and poor constantly interact, there were bound to be issues from the start. For example, the inequalities between the rich and the poor caused an immense amount of conflict between the two groups. Frank Fontaine noticed this and decided to exploit the inequalities to try and achieve power for himself. At the time, Frank Fontaine started coming up with an endgame plan. The citizens of Rapture also, at this time, started to suffer from considerable psychological strain due to the isolation and confinement of Rapture and its environment. Ryan recognized that this was becoming an issue, so he invited Dr. Sofia Lamb, a trained psychologist, to Rapture to try to help relieve these problems. Well, it seems that Dr. Lamb had some intentions of her own, so she elected to escalate tensions and the psychological problems of Rapture's citizens instead of helping them. After finding out what Lamb was doing, Ryan had her arrested and imprisoned within Persephone under some false accusations and pretenses in order to contain the influence she started to gain. Sofia Lamb would remain in prison in Persephone for the entirety of Rapture's Civil War. In addition to the psychological problems Rapture citizens were already dealing with, a condition known as confined environment psychosis started to create conflict in this constrained environment of Rapture. This, along with hyper-competitive economic systems that Rapture stood by, violence was soon to follow. During this time, Adam was also discovered, which caused the balance of power to shift. Fontaine's past as a criminal and his lust for power was multiplied with the news of Adam. The wonder drug known as Adam destabilized people mentally, while also giving them a destructive force right into the palm of their hands. With Fontaine constantly and intentionally causing tensions to become more and more severe, Rapture was beginning to get ready to implode. Fontaine, who would later become Atlas, and we'll get to that, eventually tried to overthrow Ryan and seize Rapture for himself by using excessive force. He used everything that Adam had to offer, plus Adam-wielding thugs to outgun and overpower the minimal police force that Rapture had. Fontaine then turned his attention on terrorizing the rest of the population, and then soon after, the economy of Rapture collapsed after this event. Due to Andrew Ryan and his absolutionist values, he was late and too slow to intervene when Fontaine kept growing in power and refused to regulate the atom production. Instead, Ryan decided to leave it up to the choice of the consumer. Only when it was too late, he tried to take the required measurements to fight Fontaine's war for the control of Rapture. One of the most important events that sparked Rapture's collapse was when Andrew Ryan passed a law which stated and prohibited that any contact with citizens on the surface was not allowed, as Andrew Ryan feared that what he called parasites would be sent to come and destroy his utopia. Ryan believed, for one reason or another, that secrecy would be the only way to allow Rapture to flourish and be able to build his economy and society that those damn parasites could not and would not control, destroy, or ruin. In passing this law, Fontaine saw an opening due to the demand of goods from the surface. All of this led to, you guessed it, Frank Fontaine. Fontaine, at this time, was a fishery owner who specialized in organizing a smuggling ring to fill the demands that people either wanted or needed from the surface by giving them the goods that they wanted or needed. By doing this, Fontaine was able to live comfortably with the wealth that he was achieving. This wealth, however, would be used to spread corruption and propaganda while expanding his commercial operations. This gave him all the power and money he needed to exploit the discovery of Adam by Dr. Brigid Tenenbaum, who at this point wasn't very well known. Tenenbaum witnessed and watched as a fisherman with crippled hands was playing catch at a dock. This same fisherman experienced, as some would say, a miracle. His experience was getting bit by a mysterious sea slug which was native to the area around Rapture, and started to immediately heal his hand to his original state. The natural properties of this mysterious sea slug allowed Dr. Tenenbaum to eventually develop and perfect a revolutionary genetic substance, or goo, known as Adam. When all of the mainstream labs turned her away, essentially halting her research, she had no other choice but to seek out help financially from Fontaine and his smugglers. Fontaine, being as smart as he is, recognized the potential that Adam could offer, so he decided to open up Fontaine Futuristics, which was a company whose purpose was to harness and use the power of the genetic modification that Adam caused and provided. In addition to Tenenbaum, Fontaine brought in a well-known and more classically trained geneticist named Dr. Yi Suchong. Dr. Suchong was tasked to spearhead the development of plasmids, which were commercial products that provided the user with various genetic modifications. Shortly after, the Adam culture started booming and took hold of Rapture. Things like tennis events became sponsored by telekinesis. Dentist office advertised a free plasmid sample with a routine root canal. Other products such as Fresh Hair, Sports Boost, and Instant Piano Prodigy offered citizens an easy way to obtain things like a full head of hair, physical fitness, or musical genius. Cosmetic surgery was greatly changed when doctors like J.S. Steinman realized Adam's full potential, and so on. Essentially, at the start, plasmids were used for everyday tasks and activities. Due to so much product of Adam being sold, Fontaine saw his power rise exponentially, almost rivaling the power of Andrew Ryan himself. Even with Fontaine's rapid growth of power, Ryan still failed to understand Fontaine's intentions and the threat that Adam would pose to Rapture. When this was a small problem, it could have been stopped, yet Ryan did nothing about it at all. As a matter of fact, at first, Ryan even refused to listen to people who warned him of the potential ramifications of Adam. But still, Ryan stuck by his philosophy and put responsibility on the individual and not a system of government. When Ryan finally started to see the significance of Adam's power, he still chose to not take any action. If he were to take action, however, he believed that he would be going against his own morals of his freed market ideology, and in an individual's freedom that Rapture itself was founded upon. With the negative side effects of Atom usage becoming more and more clear, Ryan still chose to not interfere. He believed that the great chain of society and Rapture would correct the issue. He told business owners, who at the time hoped that Ryan would intervene, to simply offer a better product, and asking, "What use is our ideology if our product isn't tested?" Eventually, after a long period of time, Andrew Ryan finally understood the threat that Atom and Fontaine posed to Rapture, marking him as someone to be watched. He also realized that he missed out on the Atom mark and laminated his rival's foresight into buying genotypes and nucleotide sequences. I have no idea what those are, but it sounds pretty confusing, so if I said it wrong, I apologize. Anyways, back to the video. Ryan started to figuratively feel the Great Chain pulling away from him. In his attempt to give the Great Chain a tug, it resulted in Sullivan and other members of his personal security team to investigate all of Fontaine's businesses to potentially expose all of his criminal activities between himself and his crew of smugglers, which was led by Peach Wilkins. Good old Peachy. This proved fruitless, as Fontaine offered, coerced, or even murdered any witnesses who would dare to reveal his crimes. Ryan's men eventually turned to torture tactics and other harsh methods in an attempt to gain all of the information that Ryan needed to probe and prove that Frank Fontaine was a traitor to Rapture. Despite multiple public protests, Ryan ordered that everyone convicted of smuggling would be subjected to capital punishment to maintain and ensure his control over Rapture. Andrew Ryan continued to carry out his personal war on Fontaine and the rest of his smuggling ring in Rapture. While this was going on, Fontaine fought with Ryan on a different front with his charity angle. This was inspired by Sofia Lamb's idea of the Rapture family and everything left behind after she was arrested. So, Fontaine decided to open up Fontaine's Home for the Poor, which was used to exploit the poor during their worst times. As I mentioned earlier, Fontaine was a very intelligent man, and an even better con man who could exploit people at will. He realized that he didn't need to build Rapture to make people worship you. In his own words, he says that, and I quote, "You just need to make them believe they're worth a nickel," end quote. Essentially, this gave the poor a false sense of hope and a vision that Rapture was about to be accepting of everyone. Bill McDonough referred to all of Fontaine's poorhouses as recruiting centers. Man, he was right. He also came to the conclusion that if Ryan didn't take any sort of decisive action, they'd end up dealing with an entire army of splicers. People who took refuge in these poorhouses were usually used for human experiments, like Roland Wallace, who had a new combat plasmid which Fontaine futuristics were starting to rapidly develop, tested on him. On the other side of Fontaine's charity consisted of Little Sisters orphanages. These orphanages were supposed to house these young girls, but were used for something far more sinister. All of the little girls who ended up in these orphanages were forced to become Little Sisters, which was the alternate method for making large amounts of Atom, since the sea slugs alone couldn't provide enough Atom to keep up with the commercial purposes and the commercial use of Atom production for plasmids. Ryan's war with Frank Fontaine became increasingly more and more violent. These incidents actually represented the true start of Rapture's Civil War. The multiple battles between Ryan's security and Fontaine's splicers would end up foreshadowing the nature of the war that would ensue between Ryan and Fontaine. Ryan decided to proceed with early raids against Fontaine's criminal operations, which already showed how powerful plasmids were in an instance of armed conflict. Finally, Ryan and Sullivan managed to catch a break in terms of Fontaine's smuggling operation. Yet at this time, Fontaine still managed to be out of Andrew Ryan's grasps. That was until Peach Wilkins, which was one of Fontaine's smugglers, decided to cut a deal with Ryan and essentially rat out Fontaine. McDonough suggested to Ryan that they had a valid reason to now arrest Fontaine, but that they were in dangerous territory. He also wanted Ryan to make it very clear that Fontaine's business interests wouldn't be touched. Well, Fontaine had other plans in mind. He decided that he was going to make a final stand against Ryan's security and go down guns blazing, rather than being taken as a prisoner. On September 12, 1958, Ryan's men ordered a final all-out attack on Fontaine and the rest of his remaining supporters. Immediately the next morning, the Rapture Standard paper wrote out the famous headline, "Ryan takes down smuggling operation. Fontaine and his thugs were killed in a fiery shootout." Over the next few months, the rest of the supporters and loyalists of Fontaine were tracked down, rounded up, and arrested. With no place to keep this large amount of prisoners, the Council of Rapture decided to convert Fontaine's department store into a makeshift and, quite frankly, a rather ghetto prison. This provided Ryan with a place to lock up splicers who went insane under the false accusations that they were working for Frank Fontaine. Ryan also imprisoned political opponents that he considered troublesome, people who had previously worked for Fontaine, and finally, anyone who generally caused Ryan legal problems, like Herschel Weiss, who was suing him for false advertising. At this time, Ryan was asserting total power and ruling Rapture with an iron fist. After this improvised prison was established, security was hastily prepared. Following this, Fontaine's department store was separated from Rapture and sunk to the bottom of an ocean trench. There were some supplies that were sent to inmates, but usually the prisoners were left to fend for themselves as the store slowly weakened under the ocean's natural pressure. With Fontaine being quote-unquote dead, Andrew Ryan's actions afterwards were supported by a majority of Rapture's population. At the same time, others began to question how much power over Rapture that Andrew Ryan should actually have. There were citizens who thought of Frank Fontaine's department store to that of a gulag, while other citizens complained about having to provide food and water to those who were imprisoned there. The ending of 1958 in Rapture caused a false sense of relief. However, this peace would be short-lived at this time, and on a much larger scale, a conflict was still to come. To Andrew Ryan's knowledge, Frank Fontaine was officially dead. However, these reports turned out to be over-exaggerated and completely false. Fontaine had decided to come up with a master plan to get back at Ryan and to take Rapture for himself. He decided to fake his own death to assume a new identity. From now on, he was the revolutionary man known as Atlas. To quote an audio diary from Bioshock, Fontaine states that, quote, "Ryan wanted Frank Fontaine dead. I just gave him what he wanted. As Atlas, I got a new face, a clean record, and a fresh start." End quote. The aftermath of Fontaine's fake death proved that more problems were to come for Rapture. Andrew Ryan decided to nationalize Fontaine Futuristics, which was another betrayal of his philosophies. Originally, Rapture was built to escape government and anyone Ryan deemed as a parasite. But by nationalizing Fontaine Futuristics, he justified this by claiming it was to maintain economic stability. This, however, wasn't the truth. In doing so, this caused a shakeup within Rapture and slowly started the downward decline of Rapture. Bill McDonough, who was a longtime friend of Ryan, resigned from Rapture's central console to protest Ryan's actions. Also during this time, Bridget Tenenbaum disappeared due to a crisis within her conscience. Due to her being with the Little Sisters, a sort of maternal instinct started to manifest, even though she thought she buried those types of emotions a long time ago. She hid in an underground safe house below the streets of Olympus Heights to develop a plasmid to rescue Little Sisters. She also used this as a safe house for those same rescued Little Sisters. This began her secret mission to try and rescue as many of the little sisters in Rapture as she possibly could. With Fontaine and Tenenbaum both being out of the picture, this left one person left who had the knowledge of how Adam, plasmids, and the little sisters worked. Dr. Yi Suchong. In the late months of 1958, posters of Who is Atlas started popping up all around Rapture. Many of the citizens who lived within Fontaine's poorhouses were some of the first recruits to try and form an army and overthrow Andrew Ryan. His plans, however, were halted due to Atlas being imprisoned in Fontaine's department store. He was charged by Ryan for being a supporter of Frank Fontaine. While in prison, Atlas figured out a way to send coded messages to Rapture by radio. However, he couldn't control his supporters directly in the city or escape the prison for his planned rebellion. Forced to wait and bide his time, Atlas still saw an opportunity here. He organized the prisoners and gained their loyalty by providing them food and medical care. This, however, only had limited success. Also during this failure, Atlas ordered his agents, who were still in Rapture, to obtain his ace in the hole from Dr. Suchong, but as I mentioned, this too was a total failure. And unfortunately, due to how Bioshock Infinite intertwined with Bioshock 1, I need to mention this. On December 31st, 1958, Elizabeth arranged a deal with Atlas, which resulted in a jailbreak for himself and his surviving supporters. Upon his return to Rapture, he quickly set all of his plans in motion. What happened next lives in Rapture infamy. In a televised broadcast that night on New Year's Eve, Ryan acknowledged everything that happened in the previous year, but he offered a toast to Rapture that 1959 would be Rapture's finest year. Just moments after the broadcast ended, an incident at the Kashmir restaurant occurred. The bombing of the Kashmir was the true and total start of the Rapture Civil War. For New Year's Eve, a masquerade ball was organized for all of Rapture's elite class. During this ball, a group of Atlas's organized terrorists launched an attack at the Kashmir with bombs that were planted in key locations. This attack killed and wounded many of the attendees. One of the victims was Ryan's mistress, Diane McClintock, who was injured during this planned attack. The ball proved to be an absolute opportune moment for Atlas and his supporters to launch a surprise attack. As the attack began, explosions rocked the entirety of the building, and party-goers heard swarms of splicers storming in yelling, "Long live Atlas" and "Death to Ryan," as the slaughter of the innocent crowd began. Those who weren't killed by the bombs or by Atlas's splicers were trampled as the crowds panicked to try to get out of the area. The aftermath of the bombings caused a huge jump in sales of combat plasmids like Incinerate and Electrobolt, thus causing an atom shortage. The solution was to kidnap young girls and convert them into little sisters for mass atom production. The Civil War also caused a huge increase in civilian atom usage, and that was for a good reason. This was a self-defense measure that Rapture citizens felt that they needed to take. Overall, Rapture was in total chaos, and most of the population was either growing increasingly mentally unstable or completely addicted to Adam. Although Fontaine was quote-unquote dead, Atlas rose from the ashes. He became an adversary that proved to be much more dangerous than Frank Fontaine ever was. Fontaine was looked down upon as a criminal by Rapture's public. Atlas was mysterious and represented an alternative to how Andrew Ryan was ruling over Rapture at this time. In a desperate attempt to silence Atlas, Andrew Ryan ordered to have Atlas's followers rounded up and sent into detention at Apollo Square. Ryan desperately hoped that this would put an end to the war by essentially imprisoning Atlas's followers. As you and I both know, that didn't work out at all. During the war, plasmid technologies reached their peak due to their effectiveness as weapons of war and for self-defense. With the demand of Atom increasing day by day, new plasmids were developed along with existing plasmids that were being upgraded. Due to the increase of plasmid production, Atom became a very scarce, valuable, and sought-after substance. Ryan Industries then began to use Little Sisters to mass-produce Atom by converting them into Atom gatherers. This allowed for them to walk around Rapture and extract the Atom from dead corpses of splicers with their Atom extraction needles. This was a far better option and more efficient method to producing Atom, rather than harvesting the Atom from the sea slug as it was initially done. In the long term, this turned out to be problematic. As Little Sisters usually carried large amounts of Atom with them, they became prime targets of Atom-addicted and desperate people within Rapture trying to get their fix of Atom. The desperation of trying to save their Atom production caused Ryan Industries to employ Yi Suchong. They wanted him to develop an armed protector with the nickname of the Big Daddy. Suchong wanted to genetically imprint the Little Sisters on test subjects that were placed within armored diving suits. A prototype of these armored Big Daddies were the Alpha series, who retained their sense of free will while having the ability to use plasmids. After problems with the Alpha series made them unworkable, a new series was developed that was stronger physically but lacked the free will and lacked the ability to use plasmids. Either they were armed with a gigantic drill or with a very powerful rivet gun. Big Daddies represented a strong threat to anyone who attempted to fight them or interfere with the Little Sisters that they were protected after the imprinting process was finally a success. Even with how strong these Big Daddies were, this did little to stop desperate people from attempting to kill them to get to the Little Sisters. Sometimes entire teams of Atlas's revolutionaries conducted raids that were centered around killing a Big Daddy to gain access to the Little Sisters' Atom. During an audio diary that was recorded by Diane McClintock, it states that they, quote, "went on a raid outside the wire today. We snagged 31 rounds of buckshot, 4 frag grenades, a shotgun, and 34 Atom. We lost McGee, Epstein, and Villette. We got one of those goddamn Big Daddies in the bargain, though." End quote. Diane McClintock joined Atlas's revolutionaries after the New Year's attack due to the anger she had towards Andrew Ryan for ignoring her after that attack. Just so you guys know for the context. With Andrew Ryan's initial intentions for Rapture, it was to be a peaceful utopia, so only a few weapons were allowed into the city initially for protection of the higher-ups of Rapture or for entertainment purposes, like the Rapture firing range. However, when the war broke out, citizens found unique ways to create newer and stronger weapons for themselves. For example, grenade launchers and chemical throwers were created with essentially scrap materials. In addition to that, defensive weapons like turrets and security bots were assembled in the same way. Also, household utilities like frying pans, golf clubs, rolling pins, etc. were used as melee weapons in melee combat. Essentially, everyone's energy went from making money and living their lives in Rapture to providing and trying to secure their own survival. Ryan attempted to impose order by instituting martial law in Apollo Square in order to stop suspected Atlas supporters before they could do anything destructive or harmful to Rapture or its citizens. Ryan also used the power of propaganda through a series of PSAs through a broadcast over Rapture's speaker system to counter the supporters of Atlas and to raise Rapture's citizen morale. Publications of support of Atlas's rebellion were shut down and removed. The bathysphere travel system was also locked down, and the only people who were allowed to have access to them were Ryan and his closest followers, due to the bathyspheres being keyed by the genetic frequency of Ryan and those followers. In the early stages of the war, Atlas and his forces got the upper hand, due to their use of the surprise attack on the Kashmir and by destroying citizens' confidence of their own safety within Rapture. This set the brutal tone of the war that was to follow. Warfare to gain power was a foreign affair to Ryan and other citizens in Rapture, who only wanted the open competition of the marketplace that Andrew Ryan had initially wanted. Atlas's atom-fueled guerrilla warfare was effective enough that McDonough tried to convince Ryan to seek a peace negotiation, offering Fontaine futuristics to Atlas. Ryan, however, refused McDonough's suggestion and was determined to regain his Rapture no matter the cost. With Ryan becoming more corrupt, this caused his longtime friend McDonough to turn his back on Ryan and try to go through with an assassination attempt which was unsuccessful. In the end, Ryan killed McDonough and his corpse was hung on Ryan's so-called trophy wall of betrayers. Ultimately, it was Suchong who suggested an unconventional plan to break the stalemate that divided Rapture. His proposal was that of altering the structure of the already available plasmids to make the users susceptible to mental suggestion through the use of pheromones. This was the ultimate betrayal of Ryan's philosophy, to deny a citizen's free will. However, Ryan agreed to Suchong's plan and tried to justify that Atlas and his supporters would have eventually made everyone their slaves and free will would have ceased to exist in any case. This obviously wasn't true at all, and essentially Andrew Ryan was trying to justify breaking his own morals with illogical reasonings. Anyways, I digress. With the pheromones being implemented into plasmids, it did end up turning the war into Ryan's favor for a short time. Atlas, who was currently at his most desperate state and also left with only a few unspliced followers who weren't affected by Ryan's pheromones, was forced to turn to his ace in the hole. This ace in the hole was going to change everything for Atlas, and this ace in the hole was Jack Ryan, Andrew Ryan's own bastardized and illegitimate son. If you'd like to watch the video that I did on Jack's story, there will be a card at the top right of the screen or a link down in the description. If you've played through the entirety of the original Bioshock, there really isn't too much to dive into within this section of the video. However, I will bring up a few key points just in case some viewers are unaware. Before Fontaine faked his death, he made arrangements to purchase the embryo of Ryan's illegitimate son, which was being carried by an exotic dancer that Ryan had slept with. Her name was Jasmine Jolene. With Frank Fontaine realizing that Rapture's security was coded to his genetic frequency to attack him whenever it would sense his genetic frequency, he realized that Jack could be a useful tool to help him destroy Ryan. Fontaine ordered Suchong to use his genetic technology to implement fast growth within Jack, which would allow him to reach adulthood within a few years. Jack was also mentally conditioned with a control phrase codenamed "Would You Kindly," and this would cause him to become a slave to whomever said the phrase, and he would have to obey their every command. As Jack reached Rapture through the plane crash and the lighthouse at the beginning of the game, he reached the surface of Rapture through a bathysphere. Upon arrival, Atlas spoke to him over the shortwave radio and acted as a friend to Jack, and helped guide him around to find his way around this unknown city. The entire time Atlas guided Jack around Rapture, he engraved into Jack's brain that Ryan was their enemy and that they would kill him together. Eventually, due to the "Would You Kindly" control phrase, Jack was led to the personal office of Andrew Ryan. Here, Ryan revealed that he learned that Jack was his son and a mind-controlled slave to Atlas. With Ryan having activated Rapture's self-destruct sequence, he used the same code phrase against Jack. This is when he ordered Jack to obey and kill him with a golf club, which, of course, Jack had no choice but to obey. After the death of Ryan, and with Jack stopping the self-destruct sequence of Rapture, Atlas revealed himself that he was indeed Frank Fontaine. With Jack killing Ryan and stopping Rapture's self-destruction, he basically handed Rapture over to Frank Fontaine just as he wanted. After getting chased away by security bots after Fontaine revealed himself to Jack, he crawled through an air vent shaft with the help of the rescued little sisters. Unfortunately, there was a hole in one of the vents, causing Jack to fall through and was knocked out in the process. Later, he awoke within Tenenbaum's safe house, where she was able to disable some of the mental conditioning that Fontaine had instilled within Jack. Everything, of course, except for one final code phrase, Code Yellow. This would cause Jack's heart to slowly stop over a period of time. To remedy this last code phrase, Jack needed to find 2 doses of Lot 192, which, of course, he is successful in doing so. When Fontaine finds out that Jack had broken all of the mind control phrases and what he called spells, he injected himself with a massive amount of Adam and became a physical force armed with multiple plasmids. In the end, Jack, with the help of the Little Sisters, defeated Fontaine. And obviously, however you treated the Little Sisters during your playthrough, either saving or harvesting them, would change the outcome of the finale of the game. The Civil War brought the city of Rapture, which was at the height of its civilization, to fall into complete ruin. The blame for the war, however, was due to the principles of 2 very different individuals. Frank Fontaine was a man without conscience, a power-hungry thug who was willing to murder and destroy anything in his path to achieve that power. Then you have Andrew Ryan. He was completely set in his ways with his philosophies at first, and permitted men like Fontaine to rise in power unchecked. Later on, he abandoned his principles and philosophies and embraced brutal tendencies to defend his city. With both Andrew Ryan and Frank Fontaine dead, and with many of the Little Sisters gone, Rapture went into a very dark period. Every day, its infrastructure would continue to decay, and many areas around Rapture started to become flooded. The remaining citizens of Rapture, however, developed survival strategies that allowed the city to continue and exist 8 years later for the events of Bioshock 2. In conclusion, the Rapture Civil War has always been one of the most fascinating pieces of backstory and lore that I've personally always enjoyed learning and reading about. How one man's power for hunger and another man's will to try to stop that at all costs, despite going against his own principles, really makes you think about things that occur within real life. War is never a pleasant thing, whether it's in a video game or in real life. But the simple fact and the question of why does war exist truly interests me. It seems that within the Bioshock series, there's many heartbreaking stories involving loving families. For example, we have Mark and Cindy Meltzer, Booker and Anna DeWitt, and Subject Delta and Eleanor. In today's video, I'll be going over what I believe to be the most heartbreaking and the most upsetting family story within the Bioshock series. Today, I'll be telling the story of Samuel, Mariska, and Masha Lutz, a family driven to the brink of insanity and mental breakdown, losing their daughter, and ultimately never seeing her as a normal little girl again. This story will have some sensitive topics, so viewer discretion is advised. Now, with that out of the way, let's get into the story of the Lutz family. Samuel and Mariska Lutz fell in love during Samuel's deployment during the Second World War. They met after Samuel fulfilled his mission and was stationed within Eastern Europe, most likely in the modern-day Czech Republic, as Mariska was of Czech and Jewish descent. Both Samuel and Mariska had dreams of one day becoming husband and wife, but ran into multiple issues emigrating back to the United States. That was until they caught a lucky break in the form of Andrew Ryan. A recruiter of Mr. Ryan sought out Samuel and Mariska and offered them an opportunity to move and follow them to Rapture and begin construction on the Atlantic Express train station. For Samuel and for Mariska, this was a win-win situation for the two of them. Samuel was able to get out of the army while being able to be with his wife-to-be, and Mariska would finally be able to get married to the love of her life, Samuel. They both believed that Rapture was going to be special and a way to have a brand new start within their life. Unfortunately, everything came crashing down very quickly. Their dreams of Rapture being their saving grace was short-lived. After the train station's construction was completed, Samuel was fired, and he realized that his new family couldn't ever go back to the surface. Essentially, it was a one-way trip, which resulted in him and Mariska, along with their daughter, staying in Rapture. Things became so bad that the Lutzes had to be crammed with multiple other families within the Artemis Suites just to have a place to call home. Even with all of the negativity that happened to Samuel, however, he still tried earning money to provide for his family and to try to pull them out of poverty. Unfortunately, it was all for nothing, and Samuel, Mariska, and Masha had no money, barely had a home, and it was a very unfortunate situation. The only redeeming factor that both Samuel and Mariska could look forward to was their daughter, Masha, and they absolutely loved and adored her. Unfortunately, like with many young girls within Rapture, Masha was taken away from them to become a little sister. Rapture needed Adam desperately, and Andrew Ryan was going to make sure that he provided, no matter the cost. Her abduction took place in Arcadia, while she was playing with a friend. She was told that she could, quote, help save Rapture, end quote, which you and I both know is a load of shit. After worrying and worrying about where their daughter went, both Samuel and Mariska feared the worst, and their gut instincts were 100% right. One day, while wandering around Rapture looking for Masha, they made a discovery that drove them to the point of suicide. They saw their daughter, who is now a little sister, walking hand in hand with the Big Daddy. So, they went back to their room, laid down, held each other, recorded one final audio diary, and overdosed on pills, which you can see next to them on the mattress. I could only imagine the heartbreak that parents would feel knowing that they lost their child.